I mean, it's pretty clear that Russia does not care about casualties. If you look back at the sort of campaign for us in Afghanistan, 20 years there, 454 of our brave soldiers lost their lives, and that was a big price for us to pay. If you look at Russia at the moment, they're well north of 1 million casualties now. No signs of abating. President Putin clearly doesn't care about that. But for the soldiers on the ground, it's very hard to continue pushing forward when so many of your colleagues and comrades are falling. And by all accounts, they're not clearing the bodies away. The front line is becoming a real mess.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm Louis Sykes. Today we're joined by Sean Bell, retired Air Vice Marshal and host of the Red Matrix podcast. Sean, thank you very much for joining us today.
Great to be here again, Louis. Great to be here.
Well, the building air war over Ukraine continues. The past weekend, though, we've seen more Ukrainian drone attacks on Moscow, closing a lot of Russian airports. What is the impact of these sort of harassing strikes and overall Ukraine's building drone strike capability, do you think?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, isn't it? It follows after several weeks of escalating Moscow and particularly President Putin focusing on drone attacks and cruise missile and ballistic missile attacks against a raft of targets in Ukraine. They're building towards 1,000 drones a day, which is just very dramatic. And it demonstrates that, although we talk a lot about Ukraine using drones, that Russia clearly has read that same memo as doing a lot of the same sorts of attacks. I think what's interesting about the Ukrainian efforts is that they're not going to win the war by closing down Moscow's civilian airport. But what it does do, it starts to refocus minds. It makes it clear to the Russian people that they are involved in a war, regardless of whatever they may read in sort of state-sponsored media. And also the very fact it inconveniences people and it's the Moscow elite that are being threatened, I think sends a very powerful message. But the harsh reality is that all this does is distraction. It might well encourage Russia to use more of its air defense systems. They're always limited to try and protect the Russian capital, and therefore there might be fewer available for the front line. But I have to say, as a military guy, I think, as you said, it's more harassing and getting past the sort of control of the narrative, which, of course, President Putin has with the domestic audience.
And on the other side, as you've mentioned there, Russian drone strikes on Ukraine continue to intensify. German intelligence, I believe, now actually believes Russia is aiming to conduct attacks with over 2,000 drones in one go. What can be done about these attacks? Because, even the Patriot missiles aren't really intended to stop these individual drones, are they?
No, and I think what's been interesting in some of the news, they've conflated two things. They've talked about the sort of Patriot missile system being required to deal with this threat. Let's put in context. These smaller drones are maybe $10,000 max per drone. Patriot missile systems, you're talking well north of $1 million. And so they're far more expensive. It doesn't make any sense at all. But also there are significantly more drones around than there ever would be Patriot missiles available to shoot them down. So the Patriot missile is specifically focused against that cruise missile and ballistic missile threat. They are very expensive for Russia to build. They have a very limited production capability, and therefore the more of them you can shoot out the sky, and the Patriot is ideal for that. That's desperately why Ukraine needs that to protect its towns and cities. Once you're talking about drones, you're talking about a whole load of other ways of shooting them down. Bluntly, if you lie on your back with a machine gun pointing into the air, that's quite a good way of shooting them down. Most of them are less than 150 miles an hour. So with a little bit of tracer, they're not difficult to shoot down. Also, a vast majority of them seem to be taken down now by jamming and the like. And of course, you've got some of the Ukrainian fighter jets being used, famously the F-16s being used to try and take out some of these drones as well. The problem with that is it's quite a dangerous job to do when you're flying a fighter jet. Not only is it worth a lot of money, but it generally is happiest above 400 miles an hour. The drones are flying along at 150 miles an hour. At that speed, a fighter jet is not very maneuverable at all. And I know firsthand that several Ukrainian colleagues are using these F-16s to try and shoot down the drones successfully, but it's a really dangerous mission. And I think we lost one of the F-16s only a few weeks back to this very mission.
And that's not to downplay, of course, that crucial role that those Patriot missiles do play. We're now hearing the US has moved Germany ahead of Switzerland to receive the next set of Patriot batteries. The assumption is those will then go to Ukraine, of course. But how crucial are those Patriot batteries at the moment?
Um, well, it's a difficult question. How long's a bit of string? There's several different classifications of weapons here. Bluntly, it wasn't that long ago that America stopped weapons supplies flowing and was trying to sort of hold Ukraine to account to try to force its hand to do a deal with Russia. It's only more recently that it's pretty evident that President Putin has got no intention of doing any sort of deal, and America has restarted weapons. I think the trick here is that if you look at defensive weapons, and Patriot is a defensive weapon, is designed to throw some sort of shield over the top of the main population areas, because bluntly, that seems to be what President Putin's attacking. For me, though, as soon as you start talking about the criticality of weapons, I'm much more interested in the offensive weapons. You're not going to win the war simply by shooting down some of the missiles coming in from Russia. You need to be also firing back, and also firing back with accuracy and well-informed targets. And I think part of the package that was announced by President Trump was he talked about everything being on the shelf. And there was a lot of speculation about the sorts of weapons that might be included in that. The Joint Air-to-Surface Standoff weapon, the JASM, is one of those that I think Ukraine desperately needs. It's about 250-mile range. It may not be supersonic, but it's quite fast, but also it's stealthy. And it's a lot of those sorts of weapons. They'll be the critical ones that Ukraine needs, not only to strike the oil infrastructure that is funding Putin's war, but also logistic supply lines, the tanks in the rear, the ammunition supplies, the food supplies, the fuel supplies. They're all what keeps an army on its move. And at the moment, on the front line, Russia is in the ascendancy. It is on the front foot. And therefore, Ukraine needs to do everything possible to stop that army moving forward.
And yeah, as you mentioned there, the war on the ground is continuing as well with these relatively slow Russian advances. Though it is striking that lack of movement even now. I mean, there are several towns and cities, places like Pokrovsk, Kupiansk. These are all places we have talked about the Russians trying to seize for the best part of a year now, if not in some cases over a year. The Russians just don't seem to be able to crack those, and the advances that are being made, they do seem to be going into regions that in some cases aren't even in Russia's stated objectives. I mean, is there a sign of real strategic gains being made by Russia at the moment in the East?
No, there are not. There's no real signs of that. But again, if you play the long game, I mean, it's pretty clear that Russia does not care about casualties. If you look back at the sort of campaign for us in Afghanistan, 20 years there, 454 of our brave soldiers lost their lives, and that was a big price for us to pay. If you look at Russia at the moment, they're well north of 1 million casualties now. No signs of abating. President Putin clearly doesn't care about that. But for the soldiers on the ground, it's very hard to continue pushing forward when so many of your colleagues and comrades are falling. And by all accounts, they're not clearing the bodies away. The front line is becoming a real mess. And it's becoming a terror area as well. So Ukraine has learnt a lot on the job, as it were. Where, if I study history, as I do, most of the casualties on the front line were formed by artillery shells back in the day. Today, over 80%, close to 90% of the casualties are formed by drones. First-person view drones that are carrying a hand grenade around, taking out people on the front line. They are terror weapons as well as being very effective. And I think you've also got the Russians with these barricade forces that are behind them, that if any of their soldiers turn around and flee, they get shot by their own soldiers. So it is a brutal attritional way of fighting wars. It's not good for morale. There's very little initiative used, and it's no great surprise, therefore, that the hugely brave and courageous stoical defense by the Ukrainians is massively slowing down the Russian advance. But let's be quite clear. The Russians are advancing. They are taking more and more ground. And if I was a military advisor to President Putin, I'd be going, Ukraine is struggling for arms. The Western alliance is looking a bit fragmented. It's not entirely clear where America and President Trump sits. I would be advising Putin to push for the whole of the summer. It's going to be a very difficult next few weeks for Ukraine.
Mm. I mean, yeah, and we're hearing that Russia is building up yet again more troops to try and double down on this summer offensive they've put together. Is there a reason to think, though, that Russia can turn this into any sort of breakthrough offensive with numbers alone?
Well, I'm always a bit sceptical about pontificating about what army tactics might be on the ground. But what I do get is plugged into a number of different briefings, and that's a question that pops up quite regularly and consistently. I'm being told that there is very little evidence that Russia is going to be able to make any sort of strategic breakthrough. And for some of the viewers who are less, or the listeners who are less, involved in military terms, it's a bit like plugging a dam. There are little bits of water flowing through, but are the Russians going to be able to blow a significant hole so that the dam collapses? The answer is no. That is not within their purview. Part of this, it's always more difficult on attack than it is defense because you have to leave your trenches. You have to, without cover, charge at the enemy. And of course, if you're not professionally trained, if you don't know how to use all arms, your tanks, your missiles, and air forces, then it ends up just being brutally attritional. And that's exactly where Russia finds itself today. And what's most likely, one of the worries is that it looks like Russia wants to take the whole of Ukraine. That seems to be the main ambition. I can't find any military analysts that believe that's going to be remotely possible without some sort of extensive pause to allow Russia to rearm, recharge, and refresh itself ready for that. The question really is how far it needs to go before it's ready for that pause. And I think that's what most of us are asking at the moment.
And just finally on the ground, then on this battle on the ground, what state do you judge the Russian military to really be in at this point, considering the extent of the losses they've had to take up to this point to make those gains?
Well, I think, again, it's a difficult question to answer because in the early parts of the war, we would measure that question in terms of numbers. So we'd say, well, Russia has lost 3,000 main battle tanks, and most importantly, it's lost some of its most modern battle tanks. It's lost a lot of its fighter aircraft, and therefore it's becoming less and less effective. But the flip side of that is most armies take a while to get their battle readiness. In other words, the heat of battle and work out how to avoid the nerves and actually start operating effectively. Russia now has 3.5 years of combat experience under its belt. And some of its commanders, they know what works, what doesn't work. And that's where they are quite effective. And even if the war was to end, one of the risks to NATO is that if Russia was to redistribute its forces up across the eastern flank of NATO, they may not have a match in terms of Western equipment and technology and missiles and warfighting capability. But one thing they do have in spades is battlefield experience. And as several wars, particularly World War II, showed, that can be invaluable.
Yeah, and I mean, there's not any clear sign at the moment of the war coming to an end militarily or diplomatically. Russia's so far rejected US President Donald Trump's ultimatum calling on Putin to end the war in 50 days. Ukraine has now also called for Russia to come back to the table in Turkey. Is there any hope there of rescuing those stalled ceasefire talks, do you think?
Well, I think what's interesting is watching what's happening. It's almost like sort of a bit of a dancing that's going on at the moment. As you say, there's been 2 rounds of talks in Istanbul. But let's be, again, really clear in the interest of brevity. Ceasefires only happen if they suit both sides. Either one side is won, the other side has lost, or they've hit a stalemate. None of those have happened in this particular case. President Putin is on the front foot. He is winning. Why would he stop? And therefore, there's almost no point. One of the reasons that President Zelensky, though, is doing this is because it's all around trying to secure the support of President Trump. History shows that President Putin will not stop unless he's made to stop. He won't decide to stop until he's finished with his objectives, and he's not got there yet. Now, therefore, he either gets made to stop militarily, and there doesn't seem to be any appetite at the moment in the West to get involved directly, or he gets forced to stop economically. And one of the things that President Trump threatened was 100% tariffs on anybody buying oil from Russia. That would have a massive impact on Russia's ability to fund the war and would be a very, very effective tariff. The big caveat was Trump said in 50 days. Nobody could quite understand why he did that. That buys a lot of time for President Putin. So what we're seeing from Zelensky is going, I'm prepared to talk. I'm prepared to open up new opportunities, trying to make life very difficult for Putin. But I suspect Putin's going to play the long game here. Offers of talks with President Trump in China are all part of that. But the reality is Russia has absolutely no interest in a ceasefire at the moment. Until it's achieved its military objectives, then it'll start to talk.
And I mean, the Kremlin has hinted that Putin would be willing to meet Trump perhaps in Beijing at the 80th anniversary of the end of World War II. Um, I mean, any movement there is going to take some not insignificant climb downs from either Trump and the West or Putin, given the extent of Russian territorial claims at the moment, isn't it? And I suppose on top of that as well, we've had these offers before. Is there any reason to think that this one is a real offer of actual direct talks from the Kremlin?
Well, again, I see this as a cynical view by President Putin, to be brutally honest. I mean, the one thing that he will be trying to do is avoid Trump putting these 100% tariffs on, because he knows that will be very, very difficult. So I suspect you're going to see a whole number of plays out of the Russian playbook to try to get President Trump to, and trying to play him long with all of this. The trick here is trying to get inside Trump's brain and work out why he's not being more brutal here. He's tried the carrot, that hasn't worked, but he seems reluctant to use the stick. Meanwhile, President Putin, at the moment, we have to speculate a bit, but it does look likely that until he gets the 4 regions in that sort of line from Russia to Crimea, Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson, and of course Crimea, once he gets all those, I think he might be in a position to pause. Doesn't mean it'll be over, but he'll probably take a couple of years to gather his breath before he goes again. And until he gets those secured, there's going to be no talks. And I think until then, the speculation about what Ukraine has to give up, because there's no question that Ukraine will have to cede some territory to Russia to get some form of settlement. And President Trump will put a lot of pressure on to make sure that's the case. But bluntly, this is about stopping the fighting. And at the moment, there's no incentive for Russia to do that until they're forced to. And Trump holds the aces there. He just seems to be reluctant to play them.
And meanwhile, in Europe, the Ukraine contact group are meeting today. That's largely made up of European allies of Kiev at the moment. How much they're talking largely about these purchases from the US of Patriot missiles and other weapons. How much do that initial tranche of Patriots open the door to more weapons being bought from the US, do you think?
Yes, I mean, probably understandably, the focus seems to be on Patriot missile systems and other weapons. I think the key is what's a more sustainable model. If you wind the clock back a few weeks, we had this horrible situation where Europe was desperately keen to help Ukraine to stay in the fight, whereas it appeared that President Trump was trying to stop Ukraine from fighting and basically hand Russia a blank canvas of success. Now, that was driving a huge rift between Europe and America. Now it appears, that America has realized that President Putin is just messing him around. And therefore, the question is, how do you create a sustainable model? It's quite clear that America is the biggest defense spender, doesn't want to be the only one giving weapons to Ukraine. It's therefore selling them to NATO for NATO to provide them. Bear in mind that America is a member of NATO, so it is still paying its way. But I suspect the conversation behind closed doors is not about Patriot missile systems. It's about how do we stop Ukraine losing. We've got to step up militarily. We've run out of normal weapons. There was lots of talk over the last couple of years of spinning up the European defense industrial base to produce more weapons of its own, to not only provide Ukraine support, but also backfill all of the emptying stockpiles in Western nations. But there was a lot of political rhetoric there, not much action. Now it's starting to get a degree of urgency, which is why America does have deep pockets, does have stockpiles. Therefore, what can we buy from America? But equally importantly, what is Europe going to do to try and turn the tide of this war?
And would you judge that Europe is on the right path then, if their objective is to keep that support in place for Ukraine? How should they seize the initiative now if they want to really lead on European defence and Ukrainian defence?
I think part of this is to be a lot more robust. I think although Ukraine isn't a member of NATO, so there is a body of people saying, why does it interest us? Well, it interests us because history demonstrates these wars have they often do start to spread much closer to our shores. And if you believe that President Putin is trying to rebuild the Soviet Union, there are lots of independent countries that are members of NATO, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and others. that actually are under risk of an emboldened Russia. And therefore, I think what our politicians have to do is, we're not going to stop Putin with stiff letters or waving, or strong rhetoric. It's got to be action. The only thing that's going to stop Russia is if they're made to stop. And I say that's either getting directly involved militarily. I'm not saying I'm a fan of that, but I do think there are no-fly zones. There are ways to get air power involved that Russia would struggle to combat and would minimize the risk to Western powers. But also there's a whole tranche of other measures that Europe could take and actually send a really powerful message to President Putin. I know none of them want to do that at the moment because they're scared of picking a war with Putin, but Putin is relying on that to actually continuing his advances in Ukraine. And the more he advances, the more he'll be emboldened for the future, as will China, as will Iran, as will North Korea. There's lots hanging on this. Western politicians have got some decisions to make.
Do any of these new weapons or the not quite renewed but maintenance of support from the US give Ukraine the opportunity to regain the initiative in this conflict?
Well, never say never. If you're looking from a conventional perspective, Russia is the big gorilla in the room, and Ukraine has done an amazing job to withstand the onslaught. But it's very difficult to see how Ukraine can ever sweep Russia out of its territories. I do think, though, Ukraine has always got an element of surprise on its hands. In the last few weeks, we've seen those amazing attacks, Operation Spider's Web, where Ukraine managed to take out a significant proportion of Russia's bombing fleet and intelligence gathering fleet, the mainstay, the backfires and the bears. And that was all done very carefully planned, a meticulously well-informed operation. And it just demonstrates that even the underdog can actually bite back. But let's be really clear, Russia is a grinding war of attrition. It's the bigger country. It's grinding forward. It's going to be quite difficult for Ukraine anytime soon to actually gain back its territory. It might well be able to seize the initiative again, but I very much doubt that it's going to be able to clear Russian soldiers out of Ukraine land.
Well, Sean Bell, thank you very much for joining me today on Frontline.
It's a pleasure.
You've been watching or listening to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Louis Sykes. For more on the war in Ukraine, you can subscribe to our YouTube channel and sign up for a membership, or you can hear all the latest news and analysis on Times Radio or read it at thetimes.com. And remember, we are in both podcast and video form. You can find us on your favourite podcast platform. It's Times Radio's Frontline, or you can watch us on Times Radio's YouTube channel. Thanks very much. Goodbye.